We're sitting in Washington Burch's home. Burch and his wife, Henrietta, purchased this house in 1874, just a couple of years out of slavery, and they paid $300 for the property. Henrietta we know a bit more about than we do about Washington. She belonged to the Stone Street family, and eventually the Stone Streets purchased LaGrange, and her job with the family was as a nurse to the youngest daughter, whose name was Jenny. When Jenny Stone Street married, her first husband was Oscar Ferguson, who was a doctor in town, and the Fergusons owned a lot of property in Port Tobacco. Oscar dies, and she marries Frederick Stone. What's interesting about this connection is that when the Burches buy this house, they buy it from Jenny and Frederick Stone. So Henrietta's born in about 1821. Washington's born about 1831. We know he was born in a log cabin because when he attended Benjamin Harrison's inauguration, a souvenir salesman came up and tried to sell him a little miniature log cabin. And he looked at the salesman and said, "I was born in a log cabin. Why would I want one to take home?" So that indicates that he was probably born on one of the farms in one of the slave cabins. Washington and Henrietta had 3 daughters, Elizabeth, Mary Ann, and Jenny. And their father, one of the first things he did was, with a group of other African-American men, was to buy a piece of land up on Mount Hill as a schoolhouse for the African-American children, because he wanted to make sure that his children and his grandchildren and all the other children in the village who were African-American got a good education. One of the first things Burch did out of slavery, before he even purchased the house, was he registered to vote in 1870. And then he became very active in the Republican Party. He was on the Republican Central Committee. He spent a lot of time urging other African Americans to vote, and he was very, very active in the politics of the area. Now what's interesting is that he is a Charles County employee. He began working for the county as a janitor cleaning the courthouse. Eventually he became a bailiff, and finally he was the county jailer. The jail was behind the old courthouse here in Port Tobacco and had a reputation as being rather rickety and easy to escape from. But he was paid about $60 a year, which was a very, very good sum of money for the time. There were 2 notorious cases that he was involved in. The first was in 1884, and it involved his son-in-law, William Brooks. Brooks was married to his daughter, Betsy, Elizabeth, the oldest, and he was accused of raping a white woman, which basically for a young black man at that period of time would have been an automatic death sentence. So William gets hauled into jail, and he's locked in one of the cells on the 2nd floor of the jail, and he's in shackles, and the shackles are bolted to the floor. That night, after Burch had left, because you don't have someone in the jail full-time like you do now, William Brooks managed to break up a floorboard and detach his shackles. He then pokes through the ceiling and down, through the lath and the plaster into the 1st floor, drops down, goes through the front door of the jail, climbs over the fence, and comes back to his house, which is next door to the house that I'm sitting in right now. Gets some tools, knocks the shackles off, and takes off. Washington's keys were found in the yard of the jail, and so he was accused of helping his son-in-law to escape. The initial reward offered for William Brooks was $250, and then it was up to $500. It's in the papers. Throughout 1884, they see him in Washington, they see him in Baltimore, they see him over in Prince George's County, they see him everywhere, they never catch him. And as far as we know, he got away scot-free, which is good because he would have hung for sure after that. The other case that Washington Burch was involved in was a lynching. It was the lynching of a white man by the name of Joseph Cocking. Cocking owned a store up in Hilltop, and he and his wife and their children and his sister-in-law, Daisy Miller, lived in the upstairs part of the house, and the store, of course, was downstairs. One morning, someone comes in, they can't find him anywhere. They find him in the basement, and he's tied up. Joseph Cocking is tied up. And when they go upstairs, Daisy Miller and Cocking's wife are dead. So it quickly comes to light that Cocking had tied himself up to make it look like there was a robbery and a murder. And he's arrested for murdering these two women. He is initially sent up to Baltimore. The young woman he had married, and who he subsequently was accused of murdering, was from a very old Charles County family. Cocking was from England, so basically you had old family meets mercantile money. I think the men in the family wanted to lynch him right then and there, which is why he gets sent up to Baltimore, because the jail down here by that point is such a joke. They didn't think they could secure him. There is some talk about where they're going to try him, and they eventually decide they're going to do the trial in St. Mary's County because they figured he wasn't going to get a fair trial here. But when they bring him back, they don't put him in the brand new jail in La Plata. They put him in the old jail in Port Tobacco. So late one May evening, Washington is here with Henrietta. They're both elderly by this point. They're in their 60s. Henrietta may actually be in her early 70s. They look out and they see a mob of white men coming to the house dressed as women. Now, this must have been terrifying for them, because to see a mob of white men coming to the home of an African American after dark, yelling and screaming and hollering, they probably thought that they were the target. The mob comes in and they demand the keys to the jail. First they find Henrietta hiding under a staircase somewhere in the house, and then eventually they find Washington in a closet. And they get the keys, they drag him down to the jail, they make him release Cocking, and they take Cocking down to what's now known as Cocking Creek, and they hang him off the bridge. Now this is a white man that they're lynching. Burch goes running to the sheriff, and the sheriff is sitting on his front porch and says, "Yes, I imagine I should get down there." And then Burch becomes rather frightened that Sheriff Wade isn't going to do anything. So he runs and gets the undersheriff, who is one of the barbers. And Undersheriff Barber goes to the bridge with him almost immediately, and they're too late. Cocking is dead. Now, this hit all the papers. It wasn't just here. It was in papers throughout the Mid-Atlantic region. There was an African-American paper in Richmond that basically painted Washington Burch with a very negative brush, saying, you know, how could you, a black man, be involved in this lynching when so many members of our race are being lynched? So they blamed him for taking part in it. And the truth of the matter is the man really didn't have much choice as to whether he surrendered the keys or not, because they were going to get the keys whether he was dead or alive at that point. They were called up in front of a grand jury, he and Wade and Barber, and eventually found not guilty of participating in the lynching. And they never found out who the guys in the girls' clothes were that did the lynching, although I'm sure everyone in town knew who it was. And he retired shortly after that. And then he died in 1901. And I'm sure that the shock from that had a profound effect on the last few years of his life and on the last few years of Henrietta's life. She died in 1900. One of the things that really puzzled us when we began to work on the Washington Burch story was his inventory. When someone dies, assessors would come into the home and they would count how many couches, you know, how many chairs, what kind of dishes, and that would all be added up, and that would become the value of your estate. Burch's estate had an astounding amount of glassware and 20-some platters and 2 sideboards and more chairs than you could possibly fit into this house, and we couldn't figure out why. We thought, well, maybe it's because he's really active in the African American Masonic Leagues. We know that he's active in his church. We know he's active with the school board. So maybe that's why he has all this stuff. As we began to do research, though, we discovered that in 1881, he opened an oyster house. He advertises in the Port Tobacco Times. He also owned property down in Chapel Point, which they were developing as a summer resort. And the oyster house may have been there. In 1900, shortly after Henrietta died, he sold that property to the priests at St. Ignatius. And what we think is that his daughters, or his son-in-laws, emptied the contents of the oyster house out and brought it up here, which explains this just insane amount of serving platters and glassware. As we continue to do research and learn the stories of men like Washington Burch and their wives, like Henrietta, one of the things that I think the picture that we paint of African Americans after the war is that they were poor and they didn't have any opportunities. And this is certainly true for many, many people. But there are exceptional men and women in this group here in Port Tobacco who were entrepreneurs, who built businesses. You know, so some of these men and their wives were very, very successful business people. One of the questions that we haven't answered is, why did some of these men succeed so well and why did others not do so well? We know that Washington Burch could read and write. An education will give you that leg up. So it appears that some of these people who were enslaved before the war came out of that experience with skills that enabled them to become entrepreneurs, either because they worked in the big house as domestics and cooks, because they had an education, because of their status within the larger slave population. The people who don't seem to have done as well were those who were the field hands, who didn't get the education, who maybe didn't have the connections that Henrietta Burch had when they purchased this house. They didn't have a white patron, which of course, in and of itself is fraught with a very complex, complicated relationships. And we haven't even started to look at what those relationships meant, because certainly it's not like, oh, you were my slave yesterday and today you're not. Does that change everything immediately? No, it does not. So you have patronage and education working for some freedmen, but not for others.